Welcome to Keep What You Earn, your judgment and jargon-free zone for entrepreneurs of all levels. Get ready to learn how to scale your business, save money in taxes, and create a business that grows your wealth. If it feels like the financial side of business is like eating your vegetables, well, then think of this podcast as the ranch dressing to make the process a little more enjoyable. My name is Shannon Weinstein. I'm a CPA and business owner on a mission to simplify money and empower others through knowledge. I hope this episode inspires you to take action, but remember that the information we share is for educational purposes only and is not individual tax advice. Now that we got that out of the way, let's start the show. I think it's easy for us to all subscribe to the belief that it's never too early to plan, but it's so tough to implement that. And as an entrepreneur, you're going to have constant fires to put out, constant things that are urgent or high priority or important that are going to trump all of the, oh yeah, I got to get around to doing that things on your list, right? And this is going to be your call to make this a priority. And what I'm talking about is continuity planning, succession planning, and actually sitting down and thinking about what's going to happen if your business outlives you or if you become incapacitated in some way. We're even going to talk about what happens when you feel burnt out and you just aren't in it anymore. And I brought in an expert to talk to you all today. His name is Jim Erben. He's a dear friend and an expert in all things business continuity and succession planning. And he is a keynote speaker, president at Erben Associates. And under his leadership, actually, his firm earned a spot multiple years running in the Inc. 5000 list for one of the fastest growing companies in the country. As an international speaker, Jim shares over 30 years of experience with thousands of business leaders annually. He's well known for his straightforward approach to succession or exit planning, business continuity, and executive retention. His proprietary process helps business owners navigate the complexities of succession and exit planning to help create an everlasting legacy. Really excited to have Jim on the show today to share his knowledge and to be able to help you navigate what may be your future of your business. Let's dive in and hear from Jim. Hey, Jim, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. I'm very excited.
Me too. Could you just say hello to everyone listening and let them know who you are and what you do?
Hello to everybody out there listening. My name is Jim Erben. I founded Erben Associates 30 years ago. We help people figure out what they want to do with their business from an exit or succession standpoint and help them live happily ever after.
Love it. And what types of businesses do you work with? Is there a particular type of area, size? What are your typical customers?
Typically pretty large, 25 to 700 million in revenue, all types, technology, which is a challenge for me because I'm not very technological, but construction, privately held, family-owned businesses. That's what I like. I love going in and feeling the blood, sweat, and tears on the walls.
I love it. And what are some of the major reasons they seek you out? Do they hit a point in their business? Junior doesn't want to inherit it. They hit a point financially. What are some of the main causes that people seek out your help?
Of late, I would say it's because of the coming silver tsunami, if you will. So there's 13 trillion with a T dollars of family held businesses transitioning in the next 9 years. I forget, like 10 million businesses or something like that. And they're all of a sudden realizing that their business is their largest asset. And they're starting to get worried that I'm 65, I'm 55, whatever the number is. And I look over and my wife or my husband is, we're not going to do this till we're 80. How do we get out of this? And so that's where we've probably seen the most traction in the last year or two.
And do you find that business owners who approach you are most likely kind of at that point, or do you find that they come to you in advance knowing they have to plan ahead? What position are they in when they come see you?
Great question, Shannon. So the most successful engagements we've had have been people that are 1 to 15 years out. We've helped a lot more within there that just got an offer, like a mutual friend of ours. Hey, I need some help. Or I've got a situation where somebody's started a business, they're 15 to 30 years out. What are the things they need to plan on? And we help them with that. But I want to go back, and the most successful engagements we've had have been those where we've had time to help them plan and prepare year over year so that when they do exit, they know that there's a minuscule amount, if not zero, chance of them ever running out of money.
Love it. What do you think actually, let me back up to the terms that we have here because we have continuity planning, exit planning, succession planning, all of these. I mean, I think exit planning is the most obvious, but some of these terms are kind of confusing for the average person to understand what exactly that means. Can you talk a little bit about the process or what all is entailed in this type of planning when they approach you? Maybe was it more than they thought it would be in terms of effort or the process itself?
Yes, it definitely was more than they thought it would be, and it's fluid. So I'm gonna go back over those three topics. Continuity planning, I'm gonna put to the side a second. Exit
Mhm.
and succession planning. Succession is more how do you transition your business to your key executives or your family, your kid, little Susie and Joey. That's typically what succession planning is. A lot more psychology involved, if you will, making sure that little Susie and Joey can get along with each other because after mom and dad are out of the business, if they've been bickering the whole time, they're going to continue to. That can be very disruptive. That's why 70% of businesses never make it to the second generation. On the exit planning side, it is making sure that we're doing everything we can to present the best version of your business to go to market when it's time, when the value that we valued it is such a point that you and your spouse can live happily ever after. And so, there's some commonalities between the two of them, if you will. But business valuation is one of them, and the other one now is continuity planning. Continuity planning impacts both exit and succession cases equally. They're both critical. If you think about why do you need a continuity plan, and every listener on Keep What You Earn that owns a business that is making $1 worth of money, it's like having a plant in the corner that you've been waiting on it to bear fruit. Now it's bearing fruit. And the continuity planning is who's going to take care of that plant if something happens to you. Get hit by a proverbial bus or whatever ailment, whatever it is, premature death. And you can have an agreement to buy out the spouse, life insurance, and all of that stuff. But what happens to that business or that plant, if you will, that's starting to bear fruit, and more fruit? If no one's owning it, operating it, it's going to die. And so continuity planning, most people say, oh, I got 10 million of life insurance and a shareholder agreement. That's not a plan. I want to know, what does your receptionist say when he or she answers the phone the next day after you got hit by a bus and your largest client calls? And I'm sorry to hear something happened to Jim. It's like, well, I am too, but what about my situation? I mean, I've got this, I'm expecting this order from you, or I'm expecting whatever. And continuity planning does the who, what, when, and where for the business after the new ownership and whatever's key employees or what have you are taking over the business, if you will. And if there's nobody that is a future long-term owner, what we're doing is trying to buy time. So if I got hit by a bus, I had a relatively new business. I bought out, my son got bought out of my interest because he's in my estate. We need enough time so that the business can continue to run and bear fruit. So it's not fire sold or liquidated. And so if you can keep it going, you have a viable business entity that has value to someone.
Yeah, and I think that a lot of folks get to the point where they almost have to sell or close the doors. They're either incapacitated, like you said, premature death, but beyond the death aspect, which I think that is far out of people's minds. Like it's not in our consciousness that like, oh, if I die, it seems like a very big if for a lot of young people, especially. But the incapacitation part is a really real thing. Like you could get injured, something could happen to you. In my case, my husband has a lot of health issues with his back and like he just can't do it anymore. He just can't work the way he used to. He can't function. So it's a big challenge. So like there's conversations happening around, well, how long is this going to last? Right. So it's beyond the idea of getting hit by the proverbial bus, which is like the hypothetical, right? There's a lot of real case scenarios where you're just not in it anymore. Even if your heart's just not in it anymore, figuring out what do I want to do if I just decide I don't want to do this anymore.
You're burned out,
Yeah.
or you're incapacitated. That's a lot more likely than a hit
Right.
by the bus. But you
Right.
still need to plan for it. If there's a higher likelihood of something happening, you need to plan for that. The worst, I mean, I could argue that it would be better to have premature death than incapacitation, because in premature death, you at least have some capital that you can acquire now in the form of life insurance to buy out your family. You don't really have, I mean, you can get disability insurance, which I encourage you to do, but you don't really have something to buy you out if you're incapacitated. And if you're burned out, that's a whole different scenario that's equally as critical, because you have to find somebody else. Like your husband has back problems. He has to find somebody else that he or she can take over the business and run it if they're not capable of doing it physically.
Yeah. And I mean, is there any such thing as too soon to think about this stuff and to start, for those that were listening who are like, well, I just started a business, I just turned a profit, like this is not a problem I have yet. Like I'm good for now. I'll listen to this again in a couple of years. What do you have to say to them?
If you had a twin brother or sister that had an identical business as yours, identical family, identical resources, everything's identical, and they went out and put up a well thought out plan of, if something happened to them, what would the transition of the business look like? How would the family be taken care of? How would the key employees be taken care of that helped you launch this business and get it going? And then maybe someday you're going to be in a position to exit in style with minimal risk. And you're going to be doing that year over year. And the items that you may be doing currently are going to impact you a lot more long term if you don't do them, versus the person that just keeps doing what they're doing and I'll deal with it down the road. You don't know when these events, like especially in continuity, nobody knows when these events are going to go. And if you have a profit, you have something of value to you to lose.
What happens if they don't have a plan and these things happen? What are the possible repercussions, the possible things that can happen if there is no plan in place and that proverbial bus does hit the owner? Or have you seen this happen before where it was more of a emergency situation of what to do?
Sure. Think about SBA or banks or the loans that you have. They're going to have a keen interest in getting their loan paid off if something happens to you. So you can buy insurance for that, but your business is, if you're going to stay in the privately held business circle, your business is going to wind up being one of your largest assets, unless you inherited a lot of money. And as soon as it starts making a profit, the goal is to increase those profits year over year by growing the business. Why wouldn't you want to protect that? I'm going to go back to the plant analogy. Now this plant is bearing a lot of fruit, and now there may be more plants. And now we don't have just a couple of crazy pears off the plant. Now we're creating an orchard. That's when you start bearing fruit from your business, that's when you have something to lose.
So are there any examples of like what's happened when clients didn't have a plan, or what, for our listeners, if they don't do this, what could possibly happen? What are some of the default possible outcomes if they're not doing this? Is it just that the business liquidates and that's it? Is it like a fire sale situation? What can happen to employees? Like, I just want to paint the picture for them of this is what can happen if you don't plan ahead.
Great question. Yes, all of those things that you just mentioned would happen. And I'll give you a real world example that happened to me in January of 2008. I was diagnosed with cancer. Cancer has decimated my entire family. At least, certainly on my mother's side. And the first thing I thought about was, oh my gosh, what if I don't survive this? What's going to happen to my 5-year-old son? What's going to happen to my family? What's going to happen to my key people that have hung with me? What's going to happen to my clients who have entrusted us and we've gained their trust and their confidence in us? And I may not have enough life insurance. By the way, when you've been diagnosed with cancer, that's out the window. And fortunately, I had. So some of the things that I have seen and heard, and we actually caught some grief one day from a client who we should have pushed life insurance on us more. I said, because you've had a heart attack, that's on me that you didn't want to get the life insurance. I mean, I'm not going to push you into doing anything. Here's the plan. I would suggest you have $5 million of life insurance or $2 million or 10, 100 million, whatever it is. And you didn't want to do it. And now you're uninsurable. And in that example, he did not have the capital to pay off the loans that he had in the business. So they had to sell it prematurely. It wasn't a fire sale, but he didn't get full market value for it. And probably the best wrap-up comment for listeners out there that I would give you is, if your biggest competitor got hit by a bus and you had just lost a bid or whatever to one of her key employee, if you will, you think you might go give them a call? Say, hey, John, I know things aren't going well. Shannon got hit by a bus. Why don't we go have coffee? Now you've created you've made a tragic situation more tragic because the key employees are leaving.
That's another thing to think about too. What's the impact to your team? What's the impact to your clients? This is all like, it just ripple effects out. So Jim, what are some of the maybe key elements? If I were to say a successful succession plan or continuity plan has at a minimum these core elements, or these are the must-have things that you need to be thinking about, what would you add to that list?
I would make sure that your personal wealth, however big or small that it is aligned with your exit, succession, and or continuity plan. 99.9% of the time I see them misaligned. And I'll give you an example. I had a client in San Diego who couldn't find a shareholder agreement. He just presumed everything went to his new wife, love of his life. And I said, I just really want to see it. His wills were set up fine. They were updated. So when we met, and he goes, you can tell anything in front of my Shannon. I said, okay, do you know who gets the business if something happens to you? And he said, no. And I looked at Shannon and my eyes got real big. And she goes, you have to be kidding me. Debbie, the ex-wife, gets the business? I said, yes. You talk about put a chill across my cup of coffee. That was a very tense moment, but it wasn't intentional. It was just because they're done by different groups, different lawyers, maybe sometimes different accountants. So that's one of the things that I would suggest doing. The other thing I would suggest doing would be think about what you want out of this business. Is this something you think someday you're going to fall in love with, want to transition it to your 5 and 8-year-old or someday, or which means it's at least 20 years out? Or is this something you want to build and give to your key people? Or is this an age thing? You want to be out of the business by X age? Or is it when somebody says you can exit and live happily ever after? If you start thinking about these and writing them down, it will help drive a lot of your future decisions. In addition, since you're making money now, have a continuity plan that addresses the who, what, when, and where. Make sure you have sufficient life insurance, not for today, but from where you're going to be building the business in 10 years. Because if you're ever uninsurable, the cost of capital is dollar for dollar at that point. And then make sure that you evaluate your plan year over year. So I would say if your goal is to have $500,000 of income after you're out of the business, we suggest using a 4% or less withdrawal rate. So that means if you had 10 million of personal wealth and liquidity from the business, 4% is 400,000. So I would ask you to go to at least 12. I'd rather you work longer, because if you have higher than a 4% rate of return, there's a good chance you're going to run out of money.
Yeah, that's a good point. You mentioned updating the plan, revisiting all of this. It seems like I think a lot of listeners will assume that this type of plan is costly to implement or time consuming, or that this is just, oh, this seems like a lot that I'm going to have to do. And it's a little intimidating. What advice would you give them around any concerns over actually setting this up and how to do it? What is a sufficient level of planning and documentation? Is it as simple as writing this down somewhere? Do you have to have a lawyer do it? Do you have to have an expert do it? Kind of break that down for us in terms of the process and where to start.
Let me get the cost comment you made out of the way.
Sure.
I will promise all of you listeners that the cost of not doing something will be a heck of a lot more expensive than the cost of doing something. Period. So let's get that out of the way. And statistically speaking, I don't know how many listeners are listening in right now, but there's a certain number of you that are going to have a continuity event. I mean, statistically speaking, I hope it's no one on this show. I hope it's someone else's. But statistically speaking, it's going to be incapacitation, burnout, premature death, things of that nature. What's the plan? On the flip side of that, I would tell you that who do you need? You need a lawyer to do your shareholder agreement and your wills. For starters, you have to have a legal document to do that. Secondly, I would say you need a continuity plan that addresses everything related to who, what, when, and where. If something happens to me right after this podcast, everybody in my organization knows what the critical decision that I make, who's going to be doing them. They're not going to be arguing at the water cooler because they had misinterpretations of what I told them. So you want to have a knowledge of the who, what, when, and where, and review it every year. I mean, I can ask you, Shannon, what's happened to you in the last 5 to 7 years? Anything changed? Anything going on in your family or business or where you live, what you do? Yeah, it happens.
All of the above.
Right. If I find somebody that's, oh, we did this 6 years ago. I mean, they're dead. I got them. Tell me what's changed. Oh, we've had 4 more grandkids. We've had whatever. We opened up a new business in Shanghai. I mean, whatever it is. It's not that expensive to get going now, and you build on the plan over time, but it must be fluid. It's not worth the paper it's written on if you go write it down, put it in a kind of like a business plan that never evolves.
And I mean, for a lot of listeners, they're solo business owners or they're building a business around a personal brand that they are the front and center of it. And they're probably thinking, I don't even know who would do this stuff. Jim just mentioned that there's kind of these critical decisions that you're handing off to employees. Like, shoot, I don't even have employees or I don't have team members that I feel like are critical. Is that kind of the wake up call to start thinking about your future organization, your future delegation of duties, the way that you're going to design it to transition yourself out of that front and center spotlight? Is that kind of or systems, operations, things like that?
Shannon, if you're a sole proprietor or sole entrepreneur, and I mean, you're trying to figure out a way to get that bush to bear fruit, because right now it's not. And a plant that doesn't bear fruit is not very tasty. So the goal is that you're trying, for those of you that are brand new in running a business, I'm not telling you not to focus on payroll or not to focus on making the loan payment or whatever it is. But what I am telling you, suggesting is whatever you think about in your off time or your idle time will come true. If you think about this being maybe not a profitable business, it usually won't be. If you think about this strategically and you start thinking, when do I need to start adding employees? What is our 3-year plan? I wouldn't plan out more than 3 years. But the more you think about where you're going, you don't have to focus on the motor. if you just see where you're going, the motor of your boat will drive you there.
Completely agree. Completely agree. What are some parting words of advice you have for our listeners on continuity planning or exit planning, either mistakes they can avoid or things that can help drive their success?
Biggest mistake you can avoid is not planning. Go back to your twin person analogy. You cannot tell me, no one listening to this is going to tell me, if you had a twin brother or sister that came up with a well thought out plan of how they were going to someday leave the business with a robust continuity plan that doesn't blow up their family or the business or what have you, and you just keep doing what you're doing, that you're going to beat them. All things being considered equal, they've got you. So do the plan. And it doesn't get less expensive down the road. I mean, we have people that are 2 or 3 years out from an exit event, start planning it. The cost, and I'm not talking about our cost, the cost of gifting, the cost if you wind up having to pay estate taxes, gift taxes, things of that nature, those are all expensive. Right now, some of the early listeners, some of the early business owners that are listening, come up with a continuity plan. Make sure if something happens to you, that your family's taken care of first. Secondly, make sure that you have a plan for who's going to run the business and maybe buy out your family in the event of your premature death. If you're making money and you can prove revenue and making income, make sure you have disability insurance. Because if my plan stops bearing fruit, I want to make sure that I have a continuity, a disability plan that will keep giving me fruit from another plant. It's very critical. And evolve. It's a T-Rex rule. Evolve or die. Evolve your plan. I use a lot of analogies because it helps me get a point across. There's a famous Roman philosopher, Seneca, that said, when a person does not know what harbor they are making for, no wind is the right wind. And the analogy of that is if you just go jump in a sailboat, start sailing away with no clue where you're going, you're going to wind up in a place that you may like, you may not like, but you're leaving it to chance. I don't sail, by the way, but it's just a good analogy. But if you have a ballpark destination that you want to go west or east or a specific place, it's easier to make adjustments to the business along the way.
I completely agree. You always have to set that destination in your GPS, right? Or else you're just kind of making aimless turns.
Right. You're heading to Ford and you wind up in Eugene, Oregon.
I love it. Jim, how can people find out more about you, what you're up to, and learn more from you?
You can go on my website, Jim Erben, JIMERBEN.com. We've got some of our keynotes and TED Talk on there, and there's a form that you can fill out. We'll put you on our newsletter, if you will. We send out a bi-monthly newsletter, and if you request something specifically, we'll send you out white papers or what have you. That would be the best way.
Amazing. Jim, thank you so much for being on the show today. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me, and I wish everybody a great rest of the year.
Okay, real talk. Our business can really mess with our emotions and our mindset. Am I right? One day we feel like we're unstoppable, like we could run through a wall, and then the next we want to burn it all down and start from scratch. Hey, I'm with you. A lot of this has to do with how we approach our money. And if you need a quick jolt of mindset habits for the next 5 days to help you reboot and recalibrate, check out my 5-day financial mindset refresh delivered straight to your email. Click the link in the show notes to sign up right now. Thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave a rating and review on your podcast platform. This small action goes a long way for podcasters to get our message heard by more business owners just like you. Be sure to check out the show notes for links to information about our guests and ways to get in touch with me. We'll see you on the next episode.